We have Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs, Chrystia Freeland.
Then we will have 25 minutes for questions. So it will be one question, one follow-up. I will be very strict, and I will give preference to one media at a time go around. And if a second person from that same media wants a question, then they will be in a second round. Mr. Trudeau.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we find ourselves the target of punitive tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel under pretext of a 232 national security provision. Let me be clear. These tariffs are totally unacceptable. For 150 years, Canada has been the United States' most steadfast ally. Soyons clairs, ces tarifs
Let us be clear. These tariffs are unacceptable. Over the past 150 years, Canada has been the United States' most steadfast partner. Canadians and Americans fought alongside each other during both World Wars and in Korea. The beaches of Normandy, from the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Afghanistan, we fought together, and we mourned the loss of our fallen comrades together. We're partners within NORAD, NATO, and everywhere across the world. We defended the United States after September 11th, just as the Americans defended us in the past. And we still fight together against Daesh in northern Iraq.
Alongside Americans in 2 world wars and in Korea. From the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Afghanistan, we have fought and died together. Canadian personnel are serving alongside Americans at this very moment. We are partners in NORAD, NATO, and around the world. We came to America's aid after 9/11, as Americas have come to our aid in the past, and we're fighting together against Daesh in northern Iraq. The numbers are clear. The United States has a $2 billion surplus in steel trade with Canada. And Canada buys more American steel than any other country in the world. Indeed, we account for half of U.S. steel exports. Canada is a secure supplier of aluminum and steel to the U.S. defense industry, putting aluminum in American planes and steel in American tanks. That Canada could be considered a national security threat to the United States is inconceivable. These tariffs will harm industry and workers on both sides of the Canada-U.S. border, disrupting linked supply chains that have made North American steel and aluminum more competitive all around the world. Ces tarifs douaniers nuiront.
These tariffs will harm industries and workers on both sides of the Canada-U.S. border and will disrupt supply chains that have made steel and aluminum from North America more competitive across the whole world.
These tariffs are an affront to the long-standing security partnership between Canada and the United States, and in particular, an affront to the thousands of Canadians who have fought and died alongside their American brothers in arms, comrades in arms. The ties of commerce, friendship, and in many cases, family between Americans and Canadians are undiminished. Indeed, they have never been stronger. The Government of Canada is confident that shared values, geography, and common interests will ultimately overcome protectionism. But as we have constantly said, we will always protect Canadian workers and Canadian interests. Minister Freeland is here to outline our retaliatory measures. This morning, I called the opposition leaders to inform them of our response. Comme nous l'avons toujours dit,
as we have always said, we will always protect the interests of Canadian workers and Canada's interests. Minister Freeland is here to outline our retaliatory measures. This morning, I called the leaders of the opposition to let them know what our response would be. In closing, I want to be very clear on one point. Americans remain our partners, our allies, and our friends. The American people is not the target of today's announcement. We hope that eventually common sense will triumph. Unfortunately, the actions taken today by the American government do not seem to be headed in that direction.
I want to be very clear about one thing. Americans remain our partners, our allies, and our friends. This is not about the American people. We have to believe that at some point, common sense will prevail. But we see no sign of that in this action today by the U.S. administration.
Thank you, Prime Minister. As the Prime Minister has said, these tariffs are totally unacceptable. In
response to these measures, Canada plans to impose surtaxes or other similar measures in order to limit trade on steel imports, aluminum imports, and other products from the U.S. in the amount up to $6.6 billion. That amount represents the total Canadian exports in 2017 of steel and aluminum to the U.S. Those exports that are now being targeted by the American tariffs. Today we are publishing 2 lists of products that are subject to these measures. On the first list, products will be subjected to a 25% surtax, whereas a similar measure to limit trade. The products on the second list will be subject to a 10% surtax. A similar trade limiting measure. These countermeasures will only apply to U.S. products. These countermeasures will take effect on July 1st, 2018, and will remain in force until the United States eliminate their own tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum products. Our steel and aluminum workers have our support, which is why we have included American steel and aluminum products on our lists. As for the other products enumerated today, we ensured that they can easily be obtained by American companies and our non-American trade partners to avoid costs being affecting Canadian families and consumers. Today, we will begin a consultation period that will last 15 days. We will be consulting Canadians so that they can express their support or their concerns about the proposed countermeasures, as well as the list of products. The list of products will be made public immediately and will be posted online for all Canadians to see. These unilateral measures by the U.S. are also in breach of the NAFTA rules, as well as WTO rules. Canada will be launching a conflict resolution, dispute resolution, and according to WTO rules. Canada is going to collaborate with the WTO and our other partners, including the European Union, to challenge these illegal and counterproductive American measures before the WTO. It is completely inappropriate to consider any trade with Canada as a threat to the United States' national security. I want Canadians to know that their government will always defend Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. Thank you.
No, I'm going to say it in English now. We are a bilingual country. In response to these measures, Canada intends to impose tariffs against imports of steel, aluminum, and other products from the United States, representing the total value of 2017 Canadian exports affected by the U.S. measures. That is $16.6 billion. We are imposing dollar-for-dollar tariffs for every dollar levied against Canadians by the U.S. 25% and 10% are the tariff rates today imposed by the United States on Canada. We are today publishing two lists of goods. One list which will be subject to a 25% tariff. The second list will be subject to a 10% tariff. These countermeasures will only apply to goods originating from the United States. These countermeasures will take effect on July 1st, 2018. They will remain in place until the United States eliminates its trade restrictive measures against Canada. Our steel and aluminum workers have our government's full support. That is why we have included American steel and aluminum products in our list. As for the other products listed today, we have ensured that these can be easily sourced from Canadian companies or non-U.S. trade partners in an effort to avoid any costs being passed on to Canadian families and consumers. We are today beginning a 15-day consultation period with Canadians so that they may express their support for or concerns about the proposed countermeasures and the lists of goods. These lists of goods will be made available publicly immediately, including online for all Canadians. The unilateral trade restrictions by the United States are also in violation of NAFTA and WTO trade rules. Canada will therefore launch dispute settlement proceedings under NAFTA Chapter 20 and WTO dispute settlement. Canada will also closely collaborate with like-minded WTO members, including the European Union, to challenge these illegal and counterproductive U.S. measures at the WTO. It is entirely inappropriate to view any trade with Canada as a national security threat to the United States, as the Prime Minister has explained. I want Canadians to know that our government will always stand up for Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First question, Philippe Vincent Foisy, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Good afternoon, Mr. Trudeau. Visibly, the strategy that's been in place for the last few months seems to be failing. Are you starting a trade war with the U.S.? Well, first of all, we've been saying for a long time that we're ready for anything. We have always worked in a constructive way with the Americans, but we always emphasized that we had thoughts on how we would defend Canada and Canadians' workers' interests if the need arose. So, although we continue to work and negotiate and try to convince the Americans to withdraw those unacceptable restrictions, we must also respond firmly to these threats. But with respect to the trade war, has a trade war begun? Do you still have faith in Mr. Trump? Do you still believe he's a man of his word, as you've previously said? Well, obviously, we have long engaged with the Americans in many different ways, whether it be me directly with Mr. Trump or Chrystia Freeland and other ministers who are engaged with their counterparts, whether we're talking about provincial premiers who have engaged or opposition leaders, Canada's business leaders. We are continually engaging in order to put pressure on the Americans and as well as explain to them that it would be a bad idea to create trade restrictions or any other obstacles to trade with Canada. Today's decision belongs entirely to the American administration. That was their choice. It was their choice to begin by imposing these unacceptable measures. So we are responding. As I've always clearly expressed to President Trump, we will always be defending Canadians' interests and the interests of Canadian workers.
Afternoon. So since NAFTA negotiations began, you launched a diplomatic blitz in the United States. You've been there, 15, 16 times. Minister Freeland, I don't know, maybe 100. And your surrogates were there, and you make nice with the White House, and you went all over the United States. Is it time to change the Canadian strategy?
It's very clear that we've said, and I've been saying directly to Canadians for a number of months now, that we have to be prepared for anything, and we have been. We have always chosen to try and be positive and constructive, but at the same time, in my conversations with the President, in Canadians' conversations with their American friends, colleagues, and counterparts, the message has been very clear. The Canadians stand united. The Canadians are firm about standing up for Canada's interests. The American administration has made a decision today that we deplore, and obviously is going to lead to retaliatory measures, as it must, but we regret that. We would much rather move together in partnership, understanding that no two countries have economies as interwoven and mutually beneficial as Canada and the United States.
You're hosting the G7 in a week. Mr. Trump will be there. The European allies, the EU will be there. So how is this going to work out?
Obviously, we have done a lot of work to pull people together around common and shared themes at the G7, whether it's protecting our oceans or empowering women to be more successful in the workforce, or addressing the economic challenges that happen at home and around the world. Every single G7 country is facing a similar challenge of demonstrating that growth can work for everyone. In Canada, we talk about growth for the middle class and those working hard to join it, but that is a similar challenge and responsibility for each and every one of our elected G7 colleagues. That approach is one that we're going to continue to emphasize. The choices made by the United States administration today have a goal of benefiting American workers. Unfortunately, we all know that this is going to lead to harm for American workers and American industries. Our economies are too interlinked to not have significant disruption in American families and American communities south of the border. We are going to continue to highlight that working together as friends and allies is extremely important for the prosperity of each of our citizens. Indeed, when you look at what the United States has chosen to do to its closest friends and allies, G7 nations, European allies, Canada, Mexico, it shows that we need to have an opportunity to come together to discuss this directly and firmly and look for opportunities to benefit our citizens, not to harm them.
Raymond Fillon, TVA.
Raymond Fillon, TVA. The question is inaudible for the interpreter. The administration's approach, and I have had conversations with both the President and Vice President this week, to emphasize that they have an ideology-based approach that is pro-American. But they don't quite understand that this is going to harm Americans. It's going to harm American workers and American companies. We emphasized how important the connections amongst our two economies are for citizens of both countries. Unfortunately, I think they will now discover that they cannot impose such measures without harming their own people and their own workers. You have made you've had many conversations with the President and Vice President this week. What would you say today about your failure? I think that people will understand that this is a decision made by the American administration and for the American administration. My approach, our team's approach, the approach of all Canadians has been to work together. Once again, I wish to thank all the various premiers, all the MPs from all the parties who demonstrated that we have a firm and united approach here in Canada when it it comes to these negotiations and engaging with the United States. I think people know quite well that it is despite all our efforts that the American president has chosen to make this decision today.
Prime Minister, is Mr. Trump going to be in Charlevoix?
Yes, all indications are that he will be.
There's a similar national security investigation going on into the import of autos. The finding of the steel and aluminum would suggest this is going to go against Canada too. What's your response to that?
Well, we're going to deal with this one today and deal with next steps when and if they come. But as I've highlighted many times, the argument that Canadian steel that is in American armored cars and Canadian aluminum that is in American fighter jets could somehow be a national security risk becomes even more absurd when one tries to apply it to cars or car parts made in Canada. We will continue to make arguments based on logic and common sense and hope that eventually they will prevail against an administration that doesn't always align itself around those principles.
Katie Simpson, CBC.
Prime Minister, when Donald Trump took office, you made a conscious effort to take the high road, where we saw some European leaders not necessarily take that road. But at the end of the day, you and the Europeans are in the same mess together. Has your strategy handling Donald Trump worked?
I think we all know that the relationship between Canada and the United States is a deep and complex one, and engagement and thoughtful approaches combined with the unity and the strength of the team approach that Canada has highlighted. I've heard many times from American interlocutors, from the President himself, that the fact that we are firm and united as a country in our engagement with the United States beyond political ideologies here at home has been a strength in our approach, and we are going to continue to stay united in this moment. I know Canadians will be there for one another. We will do things to stand together and stand up for our interests right across the country. That's what they expect of this government, but that's also what we expect of each other.
In your comments, and my colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you've said Donald Trump's name, and it still takes a month for these tariffs to kick in. Are you taking a firm enough line? We heard Kathleen Wynne describe Donald Trump as a bully. Do you agree with that assessment, and is this enough?
I've been very clear that my interactions with President Trump have been clear and firm. We have always, and indeed he has always understood that I will and do stand up for Canadian interests and Canadian workers and Canadian citizens. This is something that we will always do. I've made it very clear to President Trump, to Donald Trump, to Mr. Trump. I'll say it as many different ways and times as you'd like. That our relationship goes far beyond the interpersonal dynamic between two individuals. The connections between Canadians and Americans are deep, broad, multi-layered, multifaceted, commercial, cultural, familial, and those continue. This decision by the U.S. administration will hurt Canadians, it will hurt Americans, and we regret that deeply, but we'll continue to look for ways to move forward in a way that does not continue to hurt or continue to harm our citizens in both of our countries the way the actions of this administration today have. Yes.
Can I just add one thing? Katie, you asked if these measures are strong enough. And speaking about the measures specifically, the retaliatory actions, this is $16.6 billion of retaliation. This is the strongest trade action Canada has taken in the post-war era. This is a very strong response. It is a proportionate response. It is perfectly reciprocal. But I really want to assure you and to assure Canadians this is a very strong Canadian action in response to a very bad U.S. decision.
Tana McCharles, Toronto Star.
That partially deals with something I want to ask you, though. If you're targeting about $16.6 billion worth of goods, what is your assessment of the impact on the Canadian economy of all of this?
And Christia can speak to that, but one of the reasons we are a country that believes in free trade is that tariff barriers ultimately affect your own citizens most. This, as we've seen when the American government allowed moving forward on issues around softwood lumber, the costs of housing in the United States for American home buyers increased. Tariffs hurt local consumers. And as Christia has said, as we put forward our list of goods that will be subject to retaliatory tariffs, we will first of all be consulting with Canadians and industry for 15 days to ensure that there are not unforeseen or unwanted or undesirable consequences for Canadians. But at the same time, efforts have been made to look at goods that have alternatives, either Canadian alternatives or alternatives from countries with whom we have positive trade relationships that will not leave Canadians significantly out of pocket. Christia.
So Tonda, if I could, this list is a very carefully considered, very carefully put together list. We have been working on it for some time. When the Prime Minister has said that Canada is ready for every eventuality in the past, we have been ready. This is something that Canada knows how to do, that our officials know how to do. I would remind people of our experience with COOL, country of origin labeling, where Canada was also prepared to retaliate, and we had a very carefully considered list. That was in response to a WTO ruling in our favor. As the Prime Minister says, the consultation period is really, really important. We expect to get very useful feedback from Canadians, and we expect to use that period to refine the list. So please, everyone, start giving us feedback. Canadians who are watching, you can start right now. As we said, and as the Prime Minister has said, the list has been put together with a few considerations in mind. One has been to support and defend the Canadian steel and aluminum industries. They are now facing unfair barriers in their exports to the United States. It is appropriate that their U.S. competitors should face equivalent barriers in exporting to Canada. And I'd like to remind Americans who may be watching and listening that Canada accounts for, as the Prime Minister said, roughly half of U.S. steel exports. So that is one consideration. A second consideration, as the Prime Minister has said, is looking carefully at choosing goods for which there are replacements. So we've looked to choose goods for which there is a Canadian alternative, which would not face the 25 or 10% tariff, or an alternative produced by a country which is not the United States. And then finally, in putting together the list, we have tried to look for end-use products because we are mindful of the fact that imposing tariffs on products that are part of some kind of a manufacturing chain could impose costs on Canadian companies and make us less efficient. So a lot of thought has gone into it, and I think a lot of thought and a lot of work will go into refining this list in the days to come.
So as a follow-up, given that there's been discussion around your relationship, Prime Minister, with Trump and senior officials likewise, did you, in your talks in recent days, give them advance notice of exactly what you were going to do at the level? And if you have, why did all those economic arguments that you're making to us fail?
You'll have to ask the President about that. We have made consistent arguments and demonstrated in many different ways the interconnectedness of the Canada and American economies. We expect that in the coming days there will be many members of Congress, many governors who will be making representations directly to the White House on the negative impacts of the measures that the U.S. has put forward and the consequences of the measures the U.S. has put forward.
Did you give advance notice?
Tonda.
That was the part he didn't answer.
We talked about how difficult this was going to be in terms of a turning point in the Canada-U.S. relationship.
Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg.
What does this mean for NAFTA?
We continue to be open to working on a renewed and modernized NAFTA, and we will continue to sit down at the negotiating table. As I think you reported on, Josh, there was an offer that I made directly to the President last week to go down to Washington personally with Chrystia and sit down around a table with the President to work out the final details of NAFTA, because there was the broad lines of a decent win-win-win deal on the table that I thought required that final deal-making moment. I got a call from Vice President Pence on Tuesday in which it was impressed upon me that there was a precondition to us being able to get together, that Canada would accept a sunset clause for NAFTA. I had to highlight that there was no possibility of any Canadian Prime Minister signing a NAFTA deal that included a 5-year sunset clause, and obviously the visit didn't happen.
So just to be clear, you scrapped the visit because you wouldn't agree to a sunset clause, or they scrapped it?
The United States said as a precondition to us meeting and negotiating, we would have to accept a sunset clause. I said we could not accept a sunset clause in NAFTA as a precondition to meeting or as any sort of condition. But that if they were willing to take that off the precondition list, I would be happy to come down. But that was not something that could ever be acceptable to Canada, or I'm fairly certain to Mexico, in the negotiation of a North American free trade agreement.
I had the opportunity to speak with the President last Friday. I stated that I thought we were quite close to reaching an agreement, and perhaps the time had come for me to sit down with the President in Washington in order to finalize the NAFTA agreement that we already had the bones of a very good agreement for all parties, and that it might be opportune for us to sit down for a few hours and discuss it. He seemed amenable, but on Tuesday I received a phone call from Vice President Pence, who informed me that they were pleased and open to a visit by me to continue the negotiations, but that they had a precondition for such a visit. I had to agree to a sunset clause in NAFTA, which is to say that every 5 years NAFTA would come to an end unless the parties decided to renew it, which is completely unacceptable to us. So I answered that, unfortunately, if that was a precondition to my visit, I was unable to accept, and so we did not go to Washington for that day of negotiations.
That's very interesting. So I'm trying to digest that bit of news there. Thank you. I'd like to come back a bit to the G7. I'd like to know what you are going to do to coordinate action with 5 other partners, I guess, to perhaps ramp up some pressure on the United States. We have a G6 plus 1 essentially right now. So what are you going to do as the host to focus on trade?
From the very beginning of the Canadian presidency on the G7, we've been aware that there are issues that there is not consensus or unanimity on G7 partners are, particularly around trade and climate change, for example. But we also know that there is tremendous value in the 7 leading industrial nations in the world coming together to talk about shared priorities, about shared challenges, including the shared challenge that we all face in different ways of making sure that the growth we're creating within our economies benefits everyone in our economies. That's why we put forward a number and a broad range of proposals from strengthening women's entrepreneurship, to helping women and girls in developing countries around the world, to concrete action on protecting our oceans from pollution, to measures around security concerns that are active in the world, from our democracies to nuclear threats. There are a broad range of elements that we have and do and continue to agree on and work together. There are other elements in which there will be robust discussions around the table. That's one of the points of having a G7, to allow for frank and serious conversations amongst world leaders who serve populations that aren't so dissimilar in their values and approaches.
And I'd like to run something by you that Wilbur Ross said this morning, and let you both maybe to comment. He described this as, quote, blips on the radar screen. And he said that, quote, everybody has spats now and again. Every country does. Nothing weird about that. I think everybody will get over this in due course. Prime Minister, Minister Freeland?
I think the fact that the United States is invoking national security measures against Canada, against its closest allies, friends, and partners in the world, including NATO and NORAD partners, means that this is perhaps more significant than the administration realizes, and emphasize, and we will certainly hope to emphasize that by the seriousness with which we take these measures. I can tell you, for Canadian auto workers, for Canadian aluminum workers, for Canadian steel workers, these are not blips. These are real issues. These are real families who are going to get hurt by this, and that on both sides of the border. Christian.
Yeah, well, I agree 100% with what the Prime Minister has just said. We need to be very clear exactly how absurd this U.S. action is. This is a specious and unprecedented use of Section 232. Section 232, as the Prime Minister has just said, is a national security consideration. And to use this section, which is meant to give the U.S. the right to defend its national security, something that I think all countries would see as proper, to use it as a way to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum sold to the United States by its closest allies and partners in the world, by its partners in NATO, its partners in NORAD, its partners in the G7. We are partners with the United States in defending South Korea and the Korean Peninsula. To use a national security consideration as an excuse to impose these tariffs is unprecedented, and it is simply wrong. I would also just underscore, David, that, this is not about Canada. This is about the United States and a posture the United States has chosen to assume towards the rest of the world, particularly towards its closest friends and allies. These are measures that have been applied not only towards Canada, but towards the EU, towards Mexico. That is a decision the U.S. government has taken, and we believe it is a highly regrettable one, and we've said that directly to our American counterparts.
Okay, so we've got only about 2 minutes left. 6 people on the list. If we can have time for one more question. Joël Denis Bellevance de La Presse.
Joël Denis Bellevance, La Presse. I suppose that this is going to affect the schedule you had chosen for the G7. Do you know how? Well, we always expected there to be some differences of opinion amongst various G7 members, especially when it comes to climate change and international trade. We have an agenda that includes many elements upon which we agree. We're going to do some good work together for the whole world. However, we knew that we would be having some frank and honest discussions on those topics and others. And we will certainly see that the G7 continues to be useful in allowing frank and honest discussions and rigorous discussions, not only amongst leaders, but also on behalf of our citizens. Is it possible that Your government will offer financial help to the aluminum and steel industries if this trade dispute continues over time. I personally visited aluminum workers in Saguenay. I met with steel workers in Hamilton, in Regina, in Sault Ste. Marie, in order to demonstrate my support and to assure them and reassure them, this was months ago, that no matter what today's final decision was, we would be there for them, to support them, to defend the Canadian industries, to defend Canadian workers and Canadians' interests. And that is what we will surely continue to do. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming to the theater to do it.
It's a pleasure to be back, as always.
Yeah.